The Vietnam War has been portrayed in popular culture, textbooks, and documentaries in ways that have created myths so powerful they've become accepted as historical fact. Most people think they understand what happened in Southeast Asia between 1956 and 1975, but the reality is far more complex and often contradicts everything we've been taught. If you're curious about uncovering the truth behind one of America's most controversial conflicts, you've come to the right place. Subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into history's most misunderstood events, and let's explore what actually happened. First, let's talk about the jungle itself. The image most people have of Vietnam is thick, impenetrable rainforest, where visibility extends only a few feet in any direction. Movies show soldiers hacking through vines with machetes, unable to see more than arm's length away. The reality was dramatically different. Much of Vietnam's terrain, particularly in the areas where American troops operated most heavily, was not dense jungle at all. Large portions were actually secondary growth, scrubland, and even relatively open forest. During the dry season, visibility in many areas exceeded 100 yards. This mattered tremendously because it changed tactics, logistics, and the actual nature of combat encounters. The legendary invisibility of the Viet Cong wasn't because the jungle was impossibly thick. It was because they were incredibly skilled at camouflage, tunneling, and movement. They used the terrain they had, whether dense or sparse, far more effectively than American forces who were trained for different environments entirely. Soldiers from temperate climates struggled, not because they couldn't see through vegetation, but because they didn't understand the landscape's actual characteristics and how to move through it. The humidity and disease burden were real, absolutely. But the jungle wasn't the impenetrable green wall of mythology. In fact, American forces cleared significant portions of forest using chemical defoliants, which speaks to the reality that there were areas dense enough to require such measures, but also vast stretches that weren't. The point is that soldiers' difficulties in Vietnam stemmed from adaptation, training gaps, and enemy skill, not from fighting in some uniquely impassable botanical nightmare. This distinction matters because it shifts our understanding of why the war unfolded as it did. Now let's examine the equipment American soldiers actually carried and used. The popular image is of soldiers laden with heavy gear, sinking into mud, struggling under the weight of their own supplies. While soldiers certainly carried substantial loads, the narrative of Vietnam being lost because Americans were over-equipped is oversimplified. American forces had superior firepower, better medical evacuation, and more reliable supply lines than their opponents. The M16 rifle, despite early reliability issues that were eventually fixed, was a competent weapon. Body armor in the early war years was minimal, true, but this wasn't unique to Vietnam. What often gets missed is that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army operated with far less equipment, yes, but also with far fewer soldiers per unit and less complex logistics. They couldn't sustain the casualty rates that American forces could recover from. The equipment advantage America had was real and significant. The problem wasn't that American equipment was inferior. The problem was that equipment alone doesn't win wars when the political objectives remain unclear and the enemy is willing to sustain indefinite casualties. American soldiers had access to helicopters for evacuation, radios for communication, and standardized ammunition supply chains. North Vietnamese forces had bicycles and human porters carrying supplies on foot along jungle trails. From a pure material standpoint, America had overwhelming advantages. The myth that technology failed in Vietnam obscures a harder truth. Technology can't solve political problems. Soldiers weren't defeated by their gear. They were part of a larger strategy that didn't account for an enemy's determination or the domestic political cost of a prolonged conflict. This is why equipment discussions, while interesting, often miss the real reasons for outcomes in the war. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, let's address the draft, because this is where myth collides most dramatically with documented reality. The popular narrative suggests that the draft was primarily a tool that trapped poor and working-class young men, while the wealthy and educated found ways to avoid service. This image of a divided nation, with privileged boys attending college while poor boys died in rice paddies, is powerful and emotionally resonant. It's also substantially incomplete. The draft system was indeed flawed and inequitable, but the details matter. College deferments were available, yes, but they didn't function as a simple escape hatch for the rich. Many drafted men came from middle-class and educated backgrounds. Graduate school deferments, particularly for law and medicine, did skew toward students from wealthier families who could afford such education. But this represented a small percentage of total draftees. The draft ended in 1973, and by then, millions of men had served who didn't fit the stereotype of desperate, poverty-stricken conscripts. Additionally, approximately 2 million men were drafted during the entire Vietnam War period. The total American military personnel in Vietnam reached over 500,000 at peak strength. This means that volunteer enlistment, not the draft, was actually the primary source of military personnel throughout the war. The draft's most significant impact was not necessarily on individual soldiers, but on the broader American consciousness. The visibility of the draft, the lottery system introduced in 1969, and the consciousness raising surrounding it created a political liability that extended far beyond the actual percentage of men being conscripted. The myth that the draft was primarily an instrument of class oppression served important narrative and political purposes during and after the war. But it overshadows a more complicated reality involving volunteers, professional soldiers, and career military personnel who made up the bulk of forces deployed. That's not to minimize deferment inequities, which were real. It's to note that the total picture was more complicated than cultural memory typically allows. Millions of men served willingly, and millions more were drafted from across the socioeconomic spectrum. This doesn't excuse systemic unfairness, but it does complicate the triumphant myth of a wholly conscripted underclass. What we're left with is a war that was far more complex in its environmental, material, and human dimensions than popular mythology suggests. The jungle wasn't impenetrable. The equipment was generally superior on the American side. The draft, while deeply problematic and inequitable in specific ways, wasn't quite the simple tool of class oppression that cultural narratives have made it out to be. These myths persist because they serve emotional and political purposes. They help us construct stories about injustice and systems that are easier to comprehend than the messy reality of a prolonged conflict, where leadership failures, political miscalculations, and strategic misjudgments combined with real courage and sacrifice on all sides. Understanding what actually happened means accepting that complexity. If you found this exploration of Vietnam War mythology valuable, please like this video. It helps us continue producing content that challenges accepted narratives and digs deeper into history's real stories. Leave a comment telling us which aspect of the Vietnam War you'd most like to see genuinely investigated. Or share your own family's experience with this period of history. And if you haven't already, subscribe to stay updated with more myth-busting historical deep dives that go beyond what you learned in school.